Hey folks, my name is Andrew Cole. I am the Programs Coordinator at Historic Edenton State Historic Site. And today I would like to invite you to our brand new YouTube series called Historic Edenton History from Home. And what we're going to be doing today is talking a little bit about the James Iredell family home, which is located at 107 East Church Street in Edenton, North Carolina. Now, before I get to talking about the house itself and the buildings that are located on the property, I'd just like to briefly kind of talk a little bit about James Iredell and who he was. Now, James Iredell was a pretty interesting guy. He lived a very interesting life. He comes to us from Sussex County, England, and he comes to Edenton at just the age of 17. And the reason that he comes here is that he's taking a new job position. And the position that he takes is the Comptroller of Customs here at what was then referred to as the Port of Roanoke. So at times, Edenton was referred to as the Port of Roanoke. Now, while he is working this position, he does begin to mingle with the locals, and he actually befriends one of Edenton's most prominent citizens, and that is a gentleman by the name of Samuel Johnson. Now, you might know Samuel Johnson as being one of North Carolina's most revered revolutionary figures. He does later in his life become a governor of North Carolina, and he also becomes a United States Senator. But what he does for James Iredell is essentially teaches him law. James Iredell studies law under Samuel Johnson, and Samuel Johnson becomes James Iredell's mentor. Now, keep in mind, around the same time that James Iredell began practicing law here in North Carolina, that we were on the verge of the American Revolution. Today, we hail James Iredell as the pen of the American Revolution. For example, in 1774, he wrote a essay called To the Inhabitants of Great Britain, in which he denounced British parliamentary control over the colonies. And then a year later, in 1775, he wrote another essay called The Principles of the American Whig, in which he attacked the coercive acts. But around the same time that he's writing these essays denouncing Great Britain, he is also employed by the British Crown. He is actually serving as the Deputy King's Attorney for both Hertford, Perquimans, and Terrell counties. James Iredell does eventually side with the revolutionaries here in North Carolina, and he does begin to fully support independence from Great Britain. However, it does cost him. He did have an uncle who was a wealthy planter during this period, who did eventually write James out of the family inheritance for getting mixed up with the American Revolution here in North Carolina. However, by that time, James Iredell had established himself in his own right. For example, in 1773, he marries a lady named Hannah Johnston, who is his mentor's sister, Samuel Johnston's sister. In 1777, he becomes a superior judge for North Carolina, and then later in 1779, he becomes the Attorney General of North Carolina. So during this time, during the American Revolution, James Iredell is able to climb the social ladder, so to speak. Now, after the American Revolution, after the colonies had gained their independence from Great Britain, James Iredell has eventually become a leader in the state's Federalist movement. And what that means is he becomes a supporter of a stronger centralized federal government. He eventually is going to become a strong supporter of the United States Constitution, and it's going to be people like him and Samuel Johnston who helped push for the ratification of that document in North Carolina. And finally, in 1789, North Carolina becomes the second to last state to ratify the Constitution of the United States. Now, not long after that, James Iredell gets his biggest break yet, and that is he is selected to be an Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court, and that is a job that was given to him by none other than George Washington himself. And he's going to hold that position until the day he dies in 1799. So about 10 years he serves as a Supreme Court Justice, and he passes away in 1799 at the age of 48. Now, James Iredell and his wife Hannah did have 3 children together. They had a daughter named Annie. They also had a son named James Iredell Jr., and they also had a daughter named Helen. Now, James Iredell Jr. is going to go on to have his own very distinguished career in both state and federal service. He serves during the War of 1812. Later on, he practices law, and eventually he is going to be elected governor of North Carolina. And then after that, he serves as a United States Senator. So the fruit doesn't fall too far from the tree in that regard. So now that we've talked a little bit about James Iredell and the Iredell family, let's shift our focus over to the actual James Iredell house and the Iredell property. Now, if you visit the James Iredell property today, the house that you're viewing is not quite the same house that James Iredell purchased here in the 1770s. In fact, the house as it stands today, has been built upon and expanded upon at different times over the years, and it actually dates to two different time periods. So the oldest section of the house dates to the year 1800, where the newest section of the house dates to 1826 and 1827. However, it does still maintain elements of the original James Iredell house. Another thing that you'll probably notice if you visit the James Iredell property are the outbuildings. There are several outbuildings located behind the James Iredell house. Some of them are original to the property. However, many of the outbuildings have actually been moved from another historic property, and that is a place called Bandon Plantation. Now, Bandon Plantation was located on the banks of the Chowan River. It was located at what is now known as Arrowhead Beach. And unfortunately for us history lovers, that house burned down in 1963. And after that, the only thing that remained were several outbuildings which eventually would start making their way to Edenton for preservation. So, fun fact, the last person to live at Bandon Plantation was a woman by the name of Inglis Fletcher, who was an author, a novelist, and she actually wrote several books using Eastern North Carolina as a backdrop in her stories. Now, she was living at Bandon Plantation during the fire, and she was able to escape unscathed, of course. And then a year later, in 1964, the first outbuilding from Bandon Plantation makes its way to the James Iredell property for preservation. And that building is the old Bandon Plantation Schoolhouse. It's not until the early 2000s when the next group of buildings makes their way from the old Bandon Plantation property to the James Iredell property in Edenton. And those buildings include the old Bandon Plantation Smokehouse, they include the Bandon Plantation Dairy Building, and they also include part of the Bandon Plantation Kitchen, mainly the hearth. And all those buildings have since been preserved, and we use those buildings today to help educate the public about the past. Now, as I mentioned before, there are a few buildings on the James Iredell property that we believe to be original to that property, and those include the outhouse, they include the carriage house, and they also include a building that we refer to as the 1756 building. Now, you're probably wondering yourself, how do we know that building dates to 1756? Well, we know that because of dendrochronology, which is essentially the study of tree rings. And preservationists are able to date old houses by taking core samples of the interior beams of these historic homes. And that's essentially how we got the date for the 1756 building, as well as the dates for the James Iredell house. Today, the 1756 building, as well as the Bandon Plantation Smokehouse, house our new African-American exhibit called The Hands That Built a Town. This exhibit goes into great detail about the lives of African-Americans, both free and enslaved, the occupations they held, and the roles that they played both at the James Iredell property and in the creation of the town that we love so much, Edenton. Once again, my name is Andrew Cole, and I'd like to thank you for joining us for this first edition of Historic Edenton, History from Home.